Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Joining me today, Conservative MP and Brexiteer Theresa Villiers, Femi Olawale from the campaign group Our Future, Our Choice. He's campaigning for a fresh Brexit referendum. Benjamin Cohen, Editor-in-Chief of Pink News, and The Telegraph's Associate Editor, Camilla Tominey. So what's going on today?
A further idea that has emerged, and it is an idea at this stage, is to create an option to extend the implementation period for a matter of months, and it would only be for a matter of months.
But do her party believe her? The Prime Minister has this sensor for her diabetes. Why are others being denied it? And should the law be changed to allow trans people to self-identify? Theresa, extending the transition period by a few months, a good idea?
No, I just don't think it solves the issues which are blocking the negotiations.
What can you do about it?
I think the EU needs to engage more constructively on the Irish border. There are ways in which we can make it work using existing technology, existing legal procedures, and consistently with protecting the integrity of the single market. But the EU is being intransigent and not looking at these potential solutions.
Would it be helpful, Femi, to extend it?
I think it's just kicking the can down the road. I mean, the idea that they haven't managed to come up with a workable deal that has the support of Parliament, or most importantly, the British people, in up to 5 years, it's just ridiculous.
It's only a matter of months. That's what Theresa May says it will be, if needed at all. Will people believe her, Camilla?
Well, it depends how many months. And Downing Street's had this habit this week of not giving a timescale on anything that they've said. So 2 months, maybe that would be acceptable. 18 to 24, no, certainly not.
Right. Do you think it will be a case that we never actually leave?
I'm not sure. I think we will leave the EU, but I think it actually is sensible to try and extend the period for the transition. If it's possible to actually do a deal, I'm doubtful that a deal can actually be done, though.
I mean, do you believe Theresa May when she says it would only be for a matter of months?
I'm sure she's sincere in that, but it still means we go into the next financial framework period for the EU. We could end up paying a great deal of money. I'd much rather that was spent on the NHS and our priorities here.
So you don't think it would be worth paying an extra £10 billion?
No, definitely not worth paying £10 billion for an extra year or a few months on the implementation period. I think there's a real sentiment out there from Remainers and Leavers that, for goodness sake, get on with this. Prolonging the uncertainty isn't going to be helpful.
Are you running out of patience, Theresa?
I'm always patient with, the government's dedicated efforts to secure a deal. I know it's a difficult process. We've made a very big decision in this country. Implementing it takes time, effort, patience and perseverance. But I just don't think, protracting things longer than they need to be is going to help.
Is there anger, do you think, amongst Tory MPs about this?
Oh, certainly. I mean, we know from the rhetoric around the European Research Group that people just want to get on with it. I actually think as well, pragmatic Remainers who now just want Brexit to happen are speaking to their constituents. And on the doorstep, people are saying, enough's enough. They're channeling Brenda from Bristol in saying, for God's sake, please, you've made a decision, implement it and get on. And I think, actually, people are more troubled by domestic issues. Another year of transition means that more domestic issues and legislation will just be kicked into the long grass.
You were nodding there.
Well, I just think it can't be a year. It should be a few months.
Yes.
If that can actually create a deal. I think if it's possible to do a deal, then it's worth extending the implementation period a little bit. But the transition period, I don't think that it's worth just leaving this, because there's so many issues that just don't get any political attention at the moment.
And what about people's confidence in Theresa May?
Well, I think it's ebbing away because I think she's looking a little bit like the EU, intransigent. She's not listening to backbenchers. We've done a number of stories of the Telegraph with moderate Remainers who are now saying, for goodness sake, you're not going to get checkers through Parliament, readapt to a new Canada Plus style deal. I mean, Theresa's in the best position, frankly, as a former Secretary of State, to talk about the Northern Ireland border issue, which has been completely blown up out of all proportion to become this massive red herring.
Has it been blown out of all proportion?
The idea that's been blown up. I mean, have you been to...
Coin a phrase, yeah.
I've been to Belfast. I've been to the border regions. They are not saying this is blown out of proportion. Quite simply, they are terrified. I mean, you're part of an European research group that has Andrew Bridgen, who recently says that English people have the automatic right to Irish passports. You've said in the past that the border situation in Northern Ireland has been broadly consistent for the past 100 years, whereas in fact we had the Good Friday Agreement, which has massively changed things. People are trying to make this seem to be some little issue, that it's just some tool that Remainers are using to cause problems. But no, the people of Northern Ireland voted against Brexit because they know it is a disaster for Northern Ireland. Quite simply, if we start importing products which do not meet the standards of the EU, to protect its own citizens, the EU must check products that cross between the two. Now, that means a border, and that violates the Good Friday Agreement. That Good Friday Agreement was made between EU members.
Well, where I will agree is this. Clearly, it's a very important issue. All sides are committed to keeping the border as open and free-flowing in the future as it is today. That is crucial for all sorts of reasons. But we can do this, and if the EU will only engage on this constructively, we can use methods which are already in operation in ports like Rotterdam for checks remotely away from the border, for transit arrangements, which means that compliance is done at the place of dispatch, not at the physical border. And actually, if you look at borders around the world, only a tiny proportion of goods tend to be checked at a border anyway.
Well, let's go to Adam in Brussels, since Theresa has mentioned the EU. We've been talking about extending the transition period, which is what Theresa May has said. Adam, how does it move things on from the EU's perspective?
Hi, Joe. Well, the EU's theory is that if you have a longer transition period, or implementation phase, as Theresa May would call it, then that gives you more time to finalise the future relationship, which means you're more likely to have come up with either a temporary UK-wide customs arrangement of the type the UK is proposing, or a permanent end state for the customs and trade relationship between the UK and the EU that you're going to have forever. And if you have more certainty about either of those possibilities, then it seems even less likely that you're going to need your insurance policy and actually implement your infamous backstop, which would see Northern Ireland being part of the customs union and still some elements of the single market. So it's part of this strategy to just really try and ram home the message that this backstop may ultimately never be used. Now, the thing is, it is just an idea that Michel Barnier raised with ministers from the EU27 earlier this week, and which the negotiators were toying with in the talks last week. And that phrase, "it's just an idea, one of many," is the thing that's being repeated by Downing Street aides, British government spokespeople, and by the PM herself when she arrived here in Brussels a couple of hours ago for this morning's summit session.
Made good progress. We made good progress both on the withdrawal agreement and on the future partnership, our future relationship. On the withdrawal agreement, there are issues remaining around the backstop. Just to remind everybody, the backstop is what would come in place to ensure that there would be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland if the future relationship is not in place by the end of the implementation period. Now, the original proposal from the EU was one that we could not accept in the UK. It would have created a customs border down the Irish Sea. Earlier in the year, we put forward a proposal as to how to deal with this issue. A further idea that has emerged, and it is an idea at this stage, is to create an option to extend the implementation period for a matter of months, and it would only be for a matter of months. But the point is that this is not expected to be used, because we are working to ensure that we have that future relationship in place by the end of December 2020. I'm clear that it is possible to do that, and that's what we're working for. And in those circumstances, there would be no need for any proposal of this sort.
Taking a slightly defensive stance there, the Prime Minister, on this extending to the transition period. I mean, are EU leaders concerned, Adam, about how secure Theresa May is in her position?
Oh, totally, just as they have been for ages, because they can see the parliamentary arithmetic as well as you can in Westminster, so they know just how tricky it is going to be and potentially difficult to get the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship through the British Parliament. The other thing they're also worried about here in this building is that they've had their calendars out, and they too have been working out, well, how many sitting days are required for the ratification of an international treaty? How many days could the House of Lords want to discuss the withdrawal agreement bill, which writes the Brexit treaty treaty into British law? How many days or hours of discussion will there be on this meaningful vote? And they're counting back from Brexit Day, and they are watching to see the fact that time really is ticking and the timetable is getting squeezed. And it's interesting because up until now, we all thought it's the British government that are pushing for the deal to be sealed in November, but actually there's quite a few people in this building who are thinking actually it does need to be sealed in December too. That's not just a British preoccupation. And also it's just worth saying that this idea of extending the transition period to the implementation phase, really easy to say, a bit more tricky to actually do. They will have to write an extension clause into the withdrawal agreement in the next couple of weeks, because it has to be finalised in the next couple of weeks. A mechanism will have to be designed to make it happen. EU sources are telling me that it will be a joint UK-EU decision whether the extension is granted in a few years' time, which means the UK will have a veto. That's so that to guard against those accusations that the UK is being held in the transition period against its will. And then you've got the money. The EU's next 7-year budget cycle starts in 2021, January 2021. A way will have to be found to carve up the UK's financial obligations as part of that. But now it all makes sense why a few months ago we found out that some very canny British civil servants here in Brussels had got themselves on the working party that is negotiating the next budget cycle. All makes sense now, doesn't it?
Well, I'm glad you caught up with it all. So is this the reason that EU leaders were seen late-night drinking in Brussels last night?
So I was just chatting to somebody about that. The most annoying thing about that is that bar that they went to, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Charles Michel of Belgium, Xavier Bettel of Luxembourg. That bar is literally round the corner from my flat. I could have joined them if I'd known, but never mind. Actually, I think I was still here, actually.
You weren't invited? You mean you weren't invited to the late-night drinks?
No, and I could have just wandered past on my way home and joined them, but never mind.
Oh well, next time.
The thing about that is I was just chatting to a British official who works here in Brussels about that, and we were toying with this idea. Was that them sending a message, either that, you know what, this Brexit stuff, it's no skin off our nose, we've got this all under control, so much so we can go for a drink after the summit? Or was it actually a signal that actually things aren't as scary as they might have been? And in a parallel universe, if things were looking really bad, would they have been up till 2 in the morning working out their no-deal contingency planning because things were on the verge of collapse, rather than going out and having a few beers? Although I noticed Charles Michel from Belgium had a red wine rather than a Belgian beer.
Yes, I noticed he had a red wine. Well, I will let you ponder all of that. I mean, just listening to Theresa to all of that, you know, we've got the transition period. That could be extended. There could be more money demanded from the EU. Do you still have confidence in Theresa May leading these negotiations?
I do. I think she has huge resilience and fortitude, and she is, you know, she's undertaking a hugely difficult task. But she does need to listen to her backbenchers. We have grave concerns about a checkers-based agreement with the EU.
All right, well, let's get more reaction. Tory MP Philip Lee is with us from our studio, and we can also talk to Jenny Chapman in a moment from Labour, the shadow Brexit minister. Philip Lee, do you still have confidence in Theresa May?
Yes, I do, and I find the whole idea of trying to undermine the Prime Minister rather odd. The cards are the cards, and whoever's playing the cards, it makes no difference. There isn't an enthusiastic majority for any outcome in the Commons as it stands, and whoever's in charge has that to deal with. And that's why I will be marching in the people's vote on Saturday, because I think the only way out of this is to give the people the right to determine how we proceed with Brexit.
What's your reaction to this idea of extending the transition period?
Well, it's ludicrous. I mean, not only are we going to pay for the pleasure of it, but the longer this spins out, the weaker the British position comes to negotiate. I'm with Theresa on this. I find this idea that extending this transition period I've never thought it was a good idea anyway. Once we get into transition, the European Union is in a stronger position to drive a harder deal, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Well, Jenny Chapman from Labour, do you agree? Bearing in mind this has managed to unite Theresa Villiers, a Brexiteer, and a Europhile, Philip Lee, in terms of being against extending the transition period.
Well, we've always said that transition takes as long as it takes, but it ought to be as short as possible. But the frustrating thing for the Labour Party today is that actually this was so predictable, and no one likes to say we told you so, but we did. We knew that at some stage this whole process was going to hinge on the Irish border and the customs union. And there is no solution to this other than being in a customs union with the EU, which is why we said what we did so many months ago about the customs union. So we really don't have to be at this crisis point. And don't forget, today, the 18th of October, was the day that she was supposed to have her deal, and we are now behind a timetable. And so there's all this talk about extensions, and that really, if she just done what is to a lot of people the obvious thing, we wouldn't need to be here.
Right, Philip Lee, there are accusations that the government is now changing the terms of the meaningful vote that MPs thought they'd secured, which would give them the ability to amend the deal that is brought back to the House. What are your concerns?
Well, I mean, I think this is just another balloon being floated by Number 10, a desperate attempt at trying to find a way through this impasse. It's against everything that was said at the dispatch box to do what has been suggested, and also private conversations in the Commons and the Lords, private commitments made to honourable colleagues. I don't think this is going to float anyway. I'd like to challenge your characterisation of me as a Europhile, as someone who didn't actually campaign in the last referendum. I'm not. I'm a pragmatic Remainer. That's what my position has always been. And what concerns me at the moment is there are rumours of a political establishment stitch-up to put Norway in front of the House. That's not what I think people voted for in 2016, and I'm sure Theresa would agree with me.
Theresa?
Yes, certainly. If we enter a Norway-type arrangement, we wouldn't really be leaving, so we would not be respecting the result of the referendum.
But again, what can you do? I mean, there are loads of things along this process that you've objected to, Theresa, and they've all sort of come to pass. I mean, is there anything that you can do to bring pressure for these things to change?
I think it's vital to ensure that the Prime Minister and the government knows that people feel very strongly about this, that we can't let down the people who voted in that referendum. There is now, I think, a clear majority of people who voted Leave and people who voted Remain who want to respect the result. I think it would be really damaging for our democracy if we were to rip up the result and ignore it and stay in the EU in all but name.
Let's be really clear on what people voted for in 2016. We've been touring the country, Our Future, Our Choice, the Youth Movement for People's Vote. People who voted for Brexit, they wanted three things: more control over their laws, a better NHS, and to be better off. As for more control, what we're being left with is a deal that leaves us copying the rules of the EU but not giving up our dominant position in setting those rules. The NHS, well, the British Medical Association is saying that this is categorically bad for the NHS. And as for being better off, leaving the EU means that we lose the economic benefits of making it so that anything made in this country is automatically legal across Europe. That lowers prices for us. Now, if people aren't getting what they voted for, if things are going the exact opposite direction, then a people's vote is the only democratic way forward. And that's why we're marching on Saturday to demand that MPs put that decision squarely in front of the British people.
And Philip Lee agrees with you. But let me put this meaningful vote issue to you, Jenny Chapman, because although Philip says it's an idea that won't float, there is a letter from the Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, and he argues that a vote in Parliament on the final deal has to be unequivocal. What do you make of this?
Well, I read that letter, and it's similar to many letters that Secretaries of State they try and say that they have the ultimate understanding of parliamentary process, and this is what will happen because I am the Secretary of State. Actually, anyone who's been in Parliament for any length of time understands that Parliament decides how Parliament works. And he would like the vote to be seen in those terms, but actually we all understand that that isn't how it has to be. And should the withdrawal agreement be rejected by Parliament, there are any number of other ways of proceeding than leaving without a deal, it's just not viable for the country, and Parliament will not allow that to happen.
Right, well, you say that, but Philip Lee, they are pretty stark, those words that he's actually put. He says, once the deal is presented to Parliament, the procedure through which it is voted upon must allow for an unequivocal decision and one which is clear to the British public. It'll be their deal or no deal.
Yes, and that's not consistent with the assurances given in June and July of this year. Look, I think there's going to be a cross-party reaction to this. I do not see this floating at all, and I'm pretty convinced that there are various procedures in Parliament that can be followed in order to prevent a no deal if the deal is not voted for. So this is not the way to go. I mean, if I was a passionate Brexiteer, if I was Theresa, I'd be thinking to myself, the Brexit that I seek, the Brexit that I'm passionate about, I can only get that now if I put that to the people. That's what I would be arguing for and campaigning for if I was a member of the ERG.
Right, but I mean, if you listen to Andrea Leadsom, the leader of the House of Commons, she also adds grist to the mill of Dominic Raab's letter by saying that MPs would have to consider that the question facing the UK would be whether or not to accept the deal that the government had negotiated with the EU. Anything other than a straightforward approval of the deal would lead to great uncertainty to businesses and citizens, because any changes might mean that the government is not in a position to ratify the deal. So you're prepared to risk that?
Yeah, I picked this strategy in June. It's why I resigned as a minister. I resigned to seek the informed consent of the public at a second referendum because I could see where we were going. I made that case at the time on June the 12th. My position hasn't changed. This was always going to be the government's strategy, and it is just not going to wash with Parliament.
Right, but you still have confidence in the woman leading this strategy?
The Prime Minister is seeking to secure the best deal for her country and is working tirelessly to deliver that. I have been clear all along that she has my support to do that. My point is that there is not an enthusiastic majority to support this outcome, and it would be better, I think, for the Prime Minister, for the government, and above all for the country to seek an informed consent, a mandate from the people to proceed with this Brexit.
Camilla, what do you think is going to happen now? Because it's clear from both Jenny and Philip that they are not going to accept any attempt by the government to push this through, limit their ability to amend a deal.
The interesting questions that need to be asked is, first of all, what's the default position if any deal gets voted down? Because the Brexiteers think it is no deal, and the Remainers don't agree with them, point one. Point two, if there's been concern among the Remainers that Leavers didn't know what they were voting for in 2016, what is the confidence in the general public knowing what they're voting for when presented with a complex deal? How many people in the public have read the white paper concerning Chequers, for instance? So surely the same concerns must apply to any member of the public voting on what is a very complex deal involving terminology that frankly has baffled most people in the lobby, let alone the man on the street.
Philip, well, let's just get Philip's response.
Well, that isn't a reason not to consult them. I fully recognise that referenda are an absolute pain. I have absolutely no
Especially if you don't agree with the outcome.
No, absolutely. I was against having the first referendum, OK, and made that quite clear because I thought we'd end up where we are, which is right now in the middle of a mess. If we're going to proceed with this and take the British people with us, we need to get their consent. And yes, it will be challenging, and we all will have a responsibility to make sure that the information provided to the public is accurate and not distorted and not some sort of fantasy, and that applies to both sides of the argument last time round. Of course it's difficult, but please tell me what the path is from where we are, taking the public with us so that we can have a stable government in the future and get on with the domestic issues that you rightly point out the public are mainly concerned with.
But Philip's point here is that he thinks that the public isn't with the idea of either a deal, depending on acceptable, or no deal. There's quite a few members of the public now, and the polling has reflected this, who are relaxed about no deal because they just want it to happen. If you have a conflated fudge of half in, half out, that is the least popular option as far as the government's concerned, backbenchers and the public.
One example, please.
Go on.
OK, European Medicines Agency amendment, which I successfully passed through the House. The idea that the British public voted to have delays to access to new drugs for cancer and the like in 2016 is absolute nonsense. There's no way they would have been cognizant of that. Because I know this, and I'm sure there are plenty of other examples, I have a professional responsibility to seek the informed consent of the public, and that will be my intention if we get to a second referendum.
I know, but that's also missing the macro point, is that people were voting not just on specific nuances, but on a general idea of a complete separation from the EU, which people seem to miss.
All right, Femi, fine, and then we must move on.
You suggest that people didn't know you said that Remainers say that people didn't know what they voted for in 2016.
Frequently they say that.
Well, no, I'm not saying that at all. They wanted more control, a better NHS, and to be better off. And I've spoken to people in Darlington, for example, who think the idea of getting a Brexit deal that leaves us bound by rules over which we've given up control, quote, disgusting. So this is definitely definitely not the will of the people.
You've spoken to your people, Femi. You haven't spoken to all Leavers. And also, as a Remainer, how could you possibly know?
I've been speaking to Leavers specifically, especially in areas like Sunderland that will suffer the most from Brexit.
All right, we're going to move on.
The Prime Minister says she is convinced that the UK can achieve a good deal with the European Union on Brexit, despite the EU summit in Brussels ending with no sign of a breakthrough. The major sticking point remains the issue of the Irish border. But Theresa May has drawn sharp criticism from all sides of her party for suggesting that she would consider extending the amount of time that the UK remained tied to the EU and its rules and regulations in order to help secure a deal. And that could cost the UK billions more. Well, our political editor Laura Koonsberg is in Brussels for us tonight. Laura.
Sophie, this was not going to be the moment that all the problems of Brexit were magically solved. But Theresa May did come here with a whisper of a new proposal. But as she discovered yet again, when there's a hint of compromise in Brussels, there's big conflict at home.
The longer this rolls on, the more things stay the same. Europe's leaders frustrated in Brussels when Theresa May arrives with not that much to say. But listen carefully, very carefully, there comes a hint of compromise.
A further idea that has emerged, and it is an idea at this stage, is to create an option to extend the implementation period for a matter of months, and it would only be for a matter of months. But the point is that this is not expected to be used.
A tiny clue, but a big change. What she means is we might stick longer with the status quo after Brexit. Theresa May has reason to look a bit nervous about that. Longer in the departure lounge, in transition, would mean longer following EU rules without a say. And maybe these leaders would charge a bill of billions for the privilege too. They don't look worried. Instead of late-night brinkmanship, there was late-night beer drinking for Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron and a select band of other EU leaders last night. But will the idea of a longer transition make it easier to say Auf Wiedersehen to the UK? Maybe.
If the UK decided that an extension of the transition period would be helpful to reach a deal, I am sure that the leaders would be ready to consider it positively.
Maybe not.
The key element for a final deal is on the British side.
Number 10 believes, as Angela Merkel says, where there is a will, there should also be a way. Even if the idea quickens the pace in Brussels, it might get stuck at home.
We're negotiating in good faith. I'll keep it on there.
The Cabinet's nervous.
It's very nice to see you. I'm just heading.
And whether former Leavers or former Remainers, it has really riled already fractious Tory MPs.
The most common phrase to me is just get on with it. And if this means more prevarication, more delay, not bringing compression to the Commission to actually make decisions, it opens up the horror of very large sums of money possibly being handed over because we get into the next European spending round. So it's pretty unattractive.
She knows her party may well try to kill her plans, but right now she hasn't many ways out.
There's a lot of hard work ahead. There will be more difficult moments as we enter the final stages of the talks, but I'm convinced that we will secure a good deal that is in the interests of the UK and of the European Union.
You've been straining in the last couple of years to keep all the promises that you have made, whether to Brexiteers, to former Remainers, to Northern Ireland or to business. Ultimately, you are going to have to disappoint someone. Who is it going to be?
Yeah. What we have done as a government is put forward a set of proposals that deliver on the vote of the British people, that would ensure that we would end free movement, end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, end sending vast amounts of money to the European Union every year, come out of the common agricultural policy, out of the common fisheries policy, but also protect jobs and livelihoods and protect the integrity of the Union of the United Kingdom.
Theresa May has survived this far by making different vows to different sides, both here and at home, promising to keep the UK together, saying that trade won't be damaged even though we're leaving our biggest trading partner, saying she wants to take the best bits from Brussels without hurting the EU. But with time really running out, perhaps reality is emerging. It's just about impossible to keep all of those pledges. And if she breaks those promises, Ministers are all too aware. That might break her. It might be another 2 months before Theresa May's back here, if her compromises and her leadership gets that far. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Brussels.
So let's have a closer look at this issue. The UK is due to leave the European Union on March the 29th next year. That's when the so-called transition period would begin. During this time, the UK's relationship with the EU will stay largely the same. It's currently scheduled to end on the 31st of December 2020. The government hopes by that point the new trade arrangements with the EU will be in place. The suggestion of lengthening that transition period, however, would have implications. It could include Britain having to contribute to the next EU budget, and that could run to several billions of pounds. And that's what's made a lot of MPs angry, as our political correspondent Ben Wright reports.
When she gets back home, Theresa May will find no refuge from the criticism flying at her from all quarters of the Tory party. The Brexiteers are furious at the idea of a longer transition.
Well, I think it's a mistake and potentially a very costly one, because we would be into a new multi-annual financial framework, a new budget set without the UK having any vote or any veto, very unlikely to maintain our rebate, and money is scarce.
Trying to buy time with an extension of the transition or implementation period wouldn't resolve the question around the Irish border.
And that's the issue at the heart of this. Both sides have agreed in principle there must be a legal guarantee there can be no new customs or police checks installed on the Irish border after Brexit. More time to sort a trade deal might ensure that guarantee is never needed. But Tory MPs who are not Brexiteers say the idea of a longer transition period is concerning the whole party.
There are ranges of emotion, but what underlies them all is dismay. This dismay at where we seem like we're going to end up. Now, a very large number of Conservative MPs of all persuasions, Leavers and Remainers, government loyalists and, tried and tested rebels, all of them want her to change track.
The mood among Tory MPs is getting ugly. The Brexit deal emerging is angering everybody. For some, another referendum is now needed.
But even if you believe in leaving the EU, what we are heading for cannot be what people expected. And the only way we can resolve this is by giving the public an opportunity to have their own say.
Around 80 Tories share the view of this MP. Although lukewarm about a longer transition, he doesn't want the party's divisions boiling over.
What we have to do is be sensible here, not panic, not blink. We have got to continue to aim for a negotiated settlement which honours the outcome of the referendum.
Even if Theresa May gets a deal with the EU, she then faces the daunting task of getting it through the House of Commons with no majority. And Labour's opposition to the emerging deal seems to be hardening.
The Conservative Party can't agree amongst themselves about what it is that they want to negotiate, and given that they can't agree amongst themselves, they can't negotiate with the rest of Europe.
Number 10 is appealing for cool heads, but there are many here in Parliament who fear Britain is lurching out of the EU without a proper plan, and that is causing alarm. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's join our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who is in Brussels. Complicated as ever. That was the summit that had been billed as the moment of truth. What is the mood there now, particularly among EU leaders?
Well, we're sticking together and we're sticking to our script. That's been the main message from EU leaders to Theresa May today. They're saying, look, we really want a Brexit deal with the UK, but you are going to have to make more political concessions, particularly over the Irish border. Another message that came through from this summit, loud and clear to the UK, particularly from influential Germany and France, was that the UK should forget trying to soften up or woo EU leaders individually. So we heard from Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel that all 27 EU leaders, they said, are united behind their main Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier. His red lines, they said, are our red lines. That said, EU leaders didn't want to be off-putting. They wanted to be encouraging because they do want a deal. One diplomat said to me here that leaders and their staff felt like they were walking on eggshells at this summit, trying not to say things that would go down badly in the UK. So there's been talk of a deal not just being possible, but probable. But Sophie, clearly we are not there yet.
Katya Adler, thank you.
Now, Theresa May came here to Brussels yesterday hoping for generous offers, but the only one that's emerged is a Brextension, a suggested longer 21-month transition period proposed by Donald Tusk, the EU president, as a way of solving the Northern Ireland border issue. She may be forced to look this particular gift horse in the mouth, as MPs from her own party are furious and have made it clear that it's a present they really don't want. There was also a tough message from the French President, Emmanuel Macron. He said it wasn't up to the EU to make concessions to deal with British internal politics. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
In 5.5 months, Britain will be out of this room, no longer taking part in the decisions made here, but subject to the rules, in the transition period. Last night, the Prime Minister, behind closed doors, told EU leaders she was willing to consider extending that period. Today, in public, she sounded less than comfortable defending the initiative.
What has now emerged is the idea that an option to extend the implementation period could be a further solution to this issue of the backstop in Northern Ireland. What we are not doing, we are not standing here proposing an extension to the implementation period.
The Prime Minister insisted it was only an option. Government sources say it could amount to a few months' extension. European Union leaders have talked of a year's extension, and the Commission President today suggested it was a pretty good bet the option of an extension would get used.
This prolongation of the transitional period probably will happen. That's a good idea. It's not the best idea the two of us we had, but I think that this is giving us some room to prepare the future relation in the best way possible.
So why did Theresa May risk even talking about such a toxic issue on this trip?
After Brexit happens next year, Britain's due to enter into a transition period during which it negotiates a whole new relationship with the EU. But the EU's never been sure that relationship will be sorted out in time, and it's wanted a safety net or guarantee that there'll be no border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, whatever happens after the transition. Britain doesn't like the plan that the EU has come up with, Northern Ireland staying in the single market and the customs union effectively, and has come up with its own plan for a UK-wide temporary customs union with the EU. The EU is saying that is a whopping piece of work, a treaty. It'll take ages to do, and so it's asking for the transition period to be pushed further along to make time for those arrangements to be put in place. But the EU plan for Northern Ireland might still stay in the treaty that Britain exits the EU by. It's not entirely clear the other arrangement will be ready. There's a lot still undecided.
Thank you.
Back home, Theresa May's announcement seemed to unite pro-Remain and pro-Brexit Tory MPs in outrage.
During the transition period, the EU will be able to make our laws, the ECJ will be able to judge our laws, and we will have to pay for the privilege, and we will have no say over it at all. It is the vassal state. 21 months is already too long.
I was never in favour of a transition period because it puts us in a position weaker in terms of negotiating on behalf of Britain with the European Union. If we're going to extend it as well and pay for the pleasure of it, who could be in favour of this?
Last night, after Theresa May spoke for nearly 20 minutes to EU leaders, she had to leave the room to dine alone while they chewed over Brexit together at dinner and then retired to the bars of Brussels. Chancellor Merkel, asked by a passer-by how Brexit was going, said, "Please, it's a lovely evening. Let's not spoil it with that." The French president's irritation was clear in his end-of-summit press conference.
Aujourd'hui, ça n'est plus un sujet technique.
Today, it's no longer a technical issue. All the technical scenarios have been discussed. Now it is as to the political ability of the United Kingdom to reach an agreement which can be presented to us. It is not for the European Union to make some concessions in order to deal with a British political issue.
Some listening to Chancellor Merkel's remarks at the private dinner last night thought they suggested she might want more flexibility than some other leaders. Theresa May could really do with that, as time and patience back home runs very thin.
Well, Gary is with me now. Now, Gary, in the criminology of Brexit, wording matters enormously. Did she ask for more time, or was she offered it?
There is a certain amount of disingenuousness going about on this very matter. I think at the very top of both negotiating trees there's been talk for a long time. This comes against the background of this kind of talk of people looking at the duration of the transition and saying, boy, that's just not long enough, you'll never manage it. And what also matters here is that there is Article 50, the treaty that they're negotiating at the moment, that's got to be signed, sealed, delivered ahead of Brexit itself in March. That's the last opportunity to add anything to the transition. You can't just do it sometime later. It's not the way the laws of the EU work. So the door is closing. But there's this other matter, both sides are working on this, trying to get up and running something like a UK-wide customs arrangement, temporary customs arrangement, that could mean that as the British government sees it, more toxic EU version of a backstop that puts Northern Ireland in the single market of the customs union that you don't need now. Now, that process does require time, so I think this has come a little bit from both sides. Theresa May at one point in a press conference said, it is what has emerged, as if it dropped from the ceiling. I really don't think that's the case.
But more time for her is also a political poison chalice back in London, isn't it?
Yes, and back in London, things were swirling today. I heard cabinet ministers muttering that they really felt they'd been kept out of the loop. They should not be, they felt, ambushed by announcements like this. They know what it's building up to in terms of the common, the temporary customs arrangement, the UK-wide backstop. But they just didn't really appreciate waking up to those headlines. You've got, we were talking about Tories from both sides of the party uniting. She's managed to unite them, but against her and against this idea. Scottish Tories piping up saying, well, hang on, if you're extending the transition, that means the thing we were planning to campaign on for the Holyrood elections, Britain coming out of the common fisheries policy, won't actually have happened. So a lot swirling there. She's in for a very tough week next week, and she's got to do a statement about what she was up to here on Monday.
Gary, thanks very much indeed. Well, earlier I caught up with the former Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb, who is running to replace Jean-Claude Juncker as the head of the European Commission. And I began by asking if Brexit was really Europe's biggest headache.
Probably not. I think a lot of people are looking at other issues like migration, the future of work, technology and climate change. Brexit is a necessary evil, I think, for a lot of us. We don't like it, it's going to happen, and we have to get on with it.
You have very personal connections to Britain. Your wife is British. Do you think that Britain should be made an example of so that other countries don't try and do the same thing?
No, you have to look at it in three phases. The first one is the withdrawal agreement. That's where you see a lot of tough talk from Europe and tough negotiation. It's normal. Second one is the transition period, make it as long as possible. And third one is the future relationship. And I, of course, think, as a strong Anglophile, that the relationship between the UK and the EU in the future should be as close and strategic as possible.
But is your feeling at the moment that actually there might not be a deal at all?
Well, there'll be a deal at the end of the day. We always, yeah, because it goes through three phases: crisis, chaos, suboptimal solution. So we'll have a suboptimal solution at some stage. Not today, not tomorrow, not this week, but perhaps in November.
There's an opinion poll out just yesterday in Italy that Italy, one of the founding members of the European Union, only 44%, according to this poll, want to stay in the European Union. That's fewer than we have in the UK.
Yeah, it's true. But again, there is a link between Europe bashing and opinion polls. You guys bashed Europe for 40 years and you see where you ended up with Brexit. And I think we need to have a little bit more open of a discourse about what Europe is about, good and bad.
But in Italy, there hasn't been Europe bashing for as long as we've had it in the UK. And yet even there, people are losing faith.
Well, it's true. But the truth is that if you look at what Salvini is saying about Europe and the rest of it, then there's a lot of bashing going on.
He could be the next Italian Prime Minister. He sets the tone for much of European politics. How do you deal with someone like him?
Well, in Finland we have experience. There's no magic potion or one recipe, but what we did with the true Finns was to hug them to death. Took them into government in 2015. They had promised no more austerity. We pushed austerity. They had promised no more money to Greece. We gave money to Greece and they said no more migration, and 2015 was what it was. And at the end of the day, when they came to power, they realized they had responsibility. Their popularity halved and now they're out of government. So hug them to death is my answer.
You want to be the Spitzenkandidat, the leading candidate for the centre-right bloc. How will you try and reconnect that relationship between the European citizen and what goes on in this city here?
Well, the first thing to do is to connect with values, remind that we have probably the most successful model of society, which is based on human rights, fundamental rights, liberty, tolerance, equality, liberal democracy and the rule of law. That's the anchor that we have. And then second, start solving problems. That's the thing. You know, people are really afraid that they have a job in the future. People are afraid of migration, and start dealing with this. But there's so many leaders that lead right now with hate and fear, and I really hate that. If you're a political leader, you need to talk about hope and solutions, not about hate and failure.
Okay, so give me your hope and solution pitch in 20 seconds.
Yeah, first of all, take care of climate change, make Europe a leader in it, and secondly, make Europe a leader also in technological development. That's the future. You know, artificial intelligence and robotization, it's going to change the economy and work, it's going to change politics and media, science and probably the future of mankind. Let's do this together.
But do you really think that spirit of solidarity, of unity of values, which is what the European Union was founded on, actually still exists at the heart of it?
My answer is yes. We've had three big ideologies over 100 years. Fascism we killed in 1945, communism we killed in 1989, and liberalism, I hope we did not start killing in 2016 with Brexit and Trump. We need to remind ourselves that these are values which we hold true. They work and they are humanitarian.
You're not the only person who believes that. So why is that message not getting through in sufficient numbers to the citizens of Europe?
Well, it's very difficult to do the division, but I do think that people haven't rejected traditional European values of liberal democracy, but people have rejected, for instance, globalization, because some people feel that, hey, this is not a good thing for me. So my argument is that Europe is good at baking the cake and increasing the size of the economy, but it's bad at distributing it.
Alexander Stubb, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And I leave you with the words of President Macron, who said that every day there isn't a deal, a no deal becomes far more likely. A no deal used to be the freakish scenario here. Well, frankly, it's moving ever more centre stage. Back now to Krish in London. Krish.
Thanks, Matt. Well, joining me now is the Conservative MP Nick Bowles, who once backed the Chequers plan, but now has his own better Brexit idea and says Conservatives on both sides of the Brexit argument are losing confidence in Theresa May. He joins me now. Why are you losing confidence in her today?
Well, I think that so many of the things that she has told us about what she was proposing have turned out either not to be true or she hasn't stuck to them. So when the Prime Minister first suggested this transition, and remember what this transition is, we stay in the EU in effect, bound by all of its rules, in all of its institutions, paying our normal contribution for 2 years, we have no vote. It's actually worse than being a member of the EU. She said, we're going to be in there until December 2020, not to negotiate a deal, to implement a free trade deal that would already have been negotiated. Now what we hear is that actually, no, that's not enough time, and no, we're not going to be implementing, we're going to be negotiating that long-term relationship, and now we might need a third year. That third year wouldn't cost an additional 10 billion euros, it might cost 18 billion euros, because we'd be in the new budget cycle of the EU, where all of the contributions go up. That is just an absolute mile from what we were originally told was necessary.
Well, I mean, now she has united her party against her, and it doesn't look like there's going to be another EU summit until December. Haven't you got time to change the leader?
No, I don't think that's the right answer at all, but the leader has time to change her policy. And there's a very obvious solution, an alternative solution, that is gathering support across the party among Leavers and Remainers.
This is your idea?
Yes, and this is the idea that, like Norway, we go into the European Economic Area, which is the common market that binds the EU countries
Instead of the transitional period.
Instead of the
join
transitional,
EFTA for a bit.
We join EFTA and stay in the EEA, the European Economic Area. Now, what that would bring us is the following. We would immediately, next March, be out of the Common Agricultural Policy, out of the Common Fisheries Policy, and out of the European Court of Justice. That would mean that our annual contributions for future years would be substantially lower than they are for the EU, because we're out of all of those policies. We'd still be in the single market. We would then also have continuity in our customs arrangement so that we would have no issues with the Irish border. We wouldn't have some phony deadline that was imposed.
But you still don't have an answer to the Irish border, do you, for the eventual trade deal after after leaving EFTA?
No, what do you mean? We have an absolute answer that we would be in the single market, we would have customs continuity, like Norway,
forever,
for as long as we needed to reach that further deal, which of course the EU...
And that's what I mean. You don't have an answer for the Northern Ireland question for your further deal, do you?
No, because the EU won't offer us a further deal unless it solves the Irish border question. And we know that. And therefore, we will together find that solution. And we will only move on from the EEA and EFTA when we have a final deal that the EU is satisfied enough to offer us. Otherwise, they won't offer it.
Don't you need to put this back to the people? You know, they're the only people who are going to be able to sort this out because none of you politicians can agree.
No, not at all. We actually need to have a plan that can command a majority of the House of Commons, and staying in the position of Norway in the EEA and EFTA for the interim period is a proposal that could gather votes from the Labour Party, from SNP. It's practically their policy. It would get a huge number of votes in the Conservative Party. And we could then, after March, start discussing what is the long-term relationship. Is it like Canada? Is it something else? I would favour a Canada-style FTA.
Michael Gove's sort of campaign manager. Does he back this idea?
No, I don't think he does. He's in the cabinet and he's backing the Prime Minister's plan.
But he might change his mind.
No, I think what he's clear about is that he sees that the country is not ready for a no-deal Brexit, and that a deal, a negotiated settlement that takes us out of the EU on time, but keeps us in a position where we're in the single market and have customs continuity, that is a better deal than no deal.
Nick Bowles, thank you very much.
Thank you.
24 hours ago, Theresa May's idea of extending the Brexit transition period, the time between leaving and actually going it alone, seemed her best offer to try to break the deadlock on agreeing a deal with the European Union. Well, that was last night. Today, after anger back home on her backbenchers at the notion of staying in the EU any longer than necessary, there was a clarification by Mrs May. Others might call it a none too subtle rowing back. The compromise of yesterday did, though, win some approval in Brussels, a warming of relations, if not exactly progress on the detail.
Last night, Theresa May was talking to her fellow leaders about a possible extension, maybe a year, to Britain's transition out of the EU. That did not go down well back home, so this morning there seemed to be an urgent need to row back. Not a year at all, she said, much less.
A further idea that has emerged, and it is an idea at this stage, is to create an option to extend the implementation period for a matter of months, and it would only be for a matter of months.
By the time she held a press conference this afternoon, the backpedalling had gone further still. Her party in Westminster deeply unhappy. The line was that Britain wasn't really proposing an extension at all.
With every compromise you make at these talks, the transition extension just being the latest example, doesn't it become less and less likely that your party will ever be able to get behind this deal?
What has now emerged is the idea that an option to extend the implementation period could be a further solution to this issue of the backstop in Northern Ireland. What we are not doing, we are not standing here proposing an extension to the implementation period.
So it's not a year, not a few months, it's now just an option for an extension that London doesn't actually intend to use. In which case her fellow EU leaders may now be wondering why she raised it before dinner last night at all. Despite no one being sure where a breakthrough is coming from, they are at least getting on better than they were last month in Salzburg.
What I can say today is that we are in a much better mood than after Salzburg. And what I feel today is that we are closer.
And while everyone insists that a catastrophic no deal won't be allowed to happen, the French government have just published their no-deal plans and say it would have been irresponsible not to.
I'm sorry, I'm not the one who voted for Brexit. So Brexit has consequences. But we have the responsibility to be sure that the day after, in case of a no deal, everything will be organized with due processes.
Press conference is over. This summit moved with some relief from Brexit to a major meeting between European and Asian leaders, made all the more important by President Trump's hostility to free trade. Theresa May had a meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister, one of the countries with which Britain would like to sign a free trade deal once out of the EU. And yet, here tomorrow, the EU will itself sign a free trade deal with Singapore, from which British industry will benefit, at least until we leave next year. James Mace, News at 10, Brussels.
The word at Westminster today was that the Prime Minister had managed to unite the pro- and anti-Brexit wings of her party with her idea of extending the transition period, except that they were united in opposition to it, not in approval. As one former minister put it, Theresa May is losing the confidence of colleagues of all shades of opinion. As for opinions amongst business people about where we are with Brexit, MPs were in Southampton today taking soundings.
Confused about where Britain's heading after Brexit? You're not alone. A group of MPs ventured to Southampton today to find out how this port is dealing with an uncertain future. £40 billion worth of exports leave the country through here every year. Would a little more time to prepare help? This senior Conservative who voted Remain isn't convinced.
I think we need certainty as soon as possible. I would rather see as limited as possible a transition period, and I hope very much we can get on to the next stage in our relationship with our European friends.
But among the exporters and business leaders they met, there were mixed views, some telling MPs a longer transition made sense.
Our members and our organisation, the Federation of Small Businesses, were calling for a minimum of 3 years to prepare for the inevitable Brexit, and we were disappointed when it was only 2 years, so we would welcome a 3-year transition.
In a city that voted leave, but not by a huge margin, opinion remains divided.
I think it's a benefit because I think staying in the EU for however long we can would only be of benefit to the country. But I do think it's just prolonging the inevitable.
I think they explain, but then they kind of backtrack their words and then they do something else and they're just so unclear. So, yeah, that's why we're all confused.
I think actually most of the politicians in Parliament don't want us to leave and the EU don't want us to leave, and they're doing everything they can so that we don't.
As a port, Southampton has long been used to adapting to a changing world. The idea that the transition period from Britain leaving the EU to being fully independent might take a little longer has mostly been met by a weary shrug. But at Westminster today, Tory MPs from both wings of the party were very far from relaxed.
To extend it further beyond the established period at considerable financial cost because of the new budgeting period seems to me to be a very grave error.
I mean, I've always had a problem with the transition period, which is that effectively we remain in the EU, subject to all of its rules, paying our full bill, and we don't have any vote at all. But now this extra year, that is actually going to cost us more.
For those trying to keep trade flowing, though, arguing about transition might seem a bit of a sideshow when nobody's told them what the final destination or final deal might eventually look like. Libby Vina, News at 10, Southampton.
And our political editor, Robert Peston, joins me now from Brussels. Robert, this was a summit which was billed as being a decisive or definitive moment, but do you think that at the end of it there is a deal which can still be done by the Prime Minister?
Well, let's be clear. What is the big stumbling block in terms of getting a deal is the EU's insistence on the Northern Ireland remaining in the customs union and the single market on its own in the event that we can't find other ways of keeping the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland open, and that for the Prime Minister is like introducing a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Now, her proposal, and make no mistake, it was her proposal to possibly extend the period when we are non-voting members of the EU in transition, might go some way to providing a solution. But it is not the whole solution. And talking to well-placed sources here, what they say is the only way that people can be confident that Northern Ireland will not be separated in that way is if the whole of the UK were to join the customs union. Now, not just for a backstop period, but actually permanently. That, for them, is the solution.
If that solution, Robert, was achievable by Theresa May in Brussels, she still then has to sell that deal back home.
Well, this is the problem. Politically for her, that solution is a nightmare because her Brexit-supporting MPs hate the idea of permanently being in the customs union. Why is that? Because it would make it impossible for the UK to do trade deals with other countries like China and America. So the problem for her is that a deal that can be done here is not a deal she can get through her own party. We are still on the fast train to crisis.
Indeed. Robert, thank you very much indeed. Our political editor, Robert Peston, in Brussels.
Theresa May is returning from Brussels with nothing but more trouble. The prospect of a longer transition period to help find a solution to the Irish border problem seems to have united her party in fury. Until tonight, the fiercest attack came via a letter today to the Daily Telegraph, the first joint intervention by Boris Johnson and 4 other former cabinet ministers, plus Jacob Rees-Mogg. The Chequers plan is less than popular with the public than the poll tax, they said. Tonight, their voices were joined by that of MP Johnny Mercer, who in an interview published today branded Mrs May's government literally a shit show and said that if he wasn't a Tory MP, he wouldn't even vote for the party. While our political editor Nick Watt is in Brussels, where the EU summit has been in full flow earlier today. Nick, first of all, the Johnny Mercer, this was a rising star in the party. Well, may still be.
That's right. Well, look, Theresa May is still here in Brussels, not in this rather empty building, I should say. There's a rather grand dinner in a grand Brussels palace for the start of an EU-Asia summit. And it's pretty clear that her Downing Street team are digesting the news of that extraordinary intervention by Johnny Mercer, as you say, a young up-and-coming Conservative MP, former soldier, describing her government as a shit show. Now, the timing of this is absolutely dreadful because the interview was published after Theresa May managed to unite both Remainer and Leaver Conservative MPs in opposing her after she gave a favourable response to an EU idea of possibly extending the transition. She did that because the optics are looking better and she wanted to sort of go with those better optics. But she did not prepare the ground back home, and hence the very, very strong reaction. I've been this evening talking to one grandee Tory, and this person said to me, Theresa May is in a very bad place. It's embarrassment and humiliation heaped upon her. And this Tory MP, former cabinet minister, said to me, the Prime Minister is going to be in a very bad place, in big trouble next week.
If things are not going well at home, how did she get on? How did it all go down within the EU?
Well, mixed signals, a very favourable response from Angela Merkel. She talked about how both sides, the EU and the UK, need to show more flexibility. After those comments, Theresa May went upstairs and had a meeting with the German Chancellor, described as a very, very good meeting. The word that's coming back is that Angela Merkel is worried about the possibility of no deal and doesn't want to see that. The word that I'm hearing is that Angela Merkel is trying very hard and that she's putting some political capital into this issue. Now, Emmanuel Macron, the other key figure in all of this, he was not so positive. This is what he had to say.
So we confirmed and reaffirmed the mandate of Michel Barnier to finalize this negotiation, and we reaffirmed the guidelines of March 18 for this negotiation. That's it. But he will still negotiate till a final agreement, I hope, or till no deal, in case of. But my point is to say there is no political compromise, additional political compromise to be made on the European side, as now this is a British visibility to provide on the basis of this different technical scenario following their political compromise.
No additional EU compromise. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to Ian Duncan-Smith, Brexiteer, former leader of the Conservative Party, and one of the signatories to the open letter to Theresa May in today's Daily Telegraph. I started by asking what he thought about comments made tonight by Johnny Mercer in the House magazine with a rising star, where he described Theresa May's government as, I'll say it again, a shit show.
Oh, it's not the language I would use, but I can understand his frustration. I think what we saw over the last 24 hours really made people quite concerned, not just in the party, but in the country. I couldn't understand why we would offer to extend, for example, the transition period when we still haven't got anything back in return. For example, they still have the problem of the Irish backstop, which is ludicrous. They still have the problem of no future trade arrangement yet, even settled, and worse. By extending the backstop, we're likely to fall straight into the next budget of the EU, which could mean tens of billions of pounds extra to be paid across to the EU. So what happened yesterday evening, I can understand, has boiled over frustrations here, because, you know, we really are in a negotiation, and at the moment it begins to look much like a kind of capitulation rather than negotiation. We've got to get some steel in our backbone and do something about actually negotiating rather than just saying, what would you like?
Briefly, in Duncan Smith, I need your recipe for what will get us through this, very briefly.
Number one, the government has to challenge the whole existence of the backstop as it stands. They have to say, as we have published already, you can do this without any hard borders. Varadkar said the same, so has Barnier. And we say, unless you are prepared now to get off the backstop, to bin the backstop, then we have no more discussions. Take away ourselves from the table and say, we can only talk when you stop trying to point a gun at our head.
Is it the case that yourself, David Davis, Boris Johnson, and the list goes on, writing public letters, how on earth does that support Theresa May? How on earth does that show Theresa May that you've got her back?
Kirsty, it has nothing to do with writing public letters not showing support. What we say constantly, and what we have said in private as well as in public, is that the government has to deliver on what the public voted for. Most people want us just simply to get out now. And the reality is, the longer we drag this on, the more we talk about being in customs union, worrying about end dates, which will never be agreed, or for that matter, any idea of having the European Union deciding whether or not we can leave a customs union alongside our own decision. This messy process has led us to the point where we actually look like we're asking the EU for them to give us something. We don't need to do that. We have a negotiation, and we should be saying to them, we know what our baseline is. We are not going to be in the customs union. That's what Theresa May said. We're not going to be in the single market. Theresa May said that. We're going to take back control of our laws, our borders, and our money.
Is Theresa May the only person that can deliver this deal?
I have always said from the word go that I want her to succeed, and I support her, and I continue to support her. But I want her to know is that we now need to stop trying to ask or beg the EU to give us some kind of favour or to let us have the Chequers deal with a special deal.
And if she
we
won't?
Need to say to them,
and if
look,
she won't?
Well, she's going to. She said already she wants a free trade deal. The thing that stands in the way of the free trade deal right now is an absurd position over Northern Ireland. And the EU made us, made the declaration back in December. We should never have signed up to that, but we never ratified it. So it is not bound in at all. Nothing is agreed till everything is agreed.
Just to be absolutely clear about this, there is no way that you think that anyone other than Theresa May should be doing this.
No, I absolutely want her to do the right thing. And I want her to have a negotiator and a negotiating team that doesn't get into the mess it got into a week ago by agreeing to do things that were completely unacceptable to the British government. So we have to have the Brexit secretary go over on a Sunday evening to say, sorry, we can't sign up to what our negotiators have been negotiating.
Just very quickly,
they need
and finally,
to do
so we're
what
running
the
out of
government
time.
said they would do.
Just because we're running out of time. If indeed the transition period was to carry on longer, a year say, then it looked like that we might have to deliver £10 billion to the EU. We've got terrible trouble with universal credit. You walked away because the coffers were depleted. What would that £10 billion do to universal credit?
Well, it would be even more than I want for UC, but for other programmes as well. I think it would be very hard to tell the British people that we're extending another year or more into the implementation phase, and we're then going to pay tens of billions of pounds over when we actually say we need it for other domestic programmes. And that's exactly the point of why we wanted to leave, to take back control of our laws, our borders and our money. And it's very simple, Kirsty. It's very, very simple. We now need to say to the EU that there's no way on earth that we're going to give you any extensions. We have no agreement over the backstop. We have no agreement at the moment over the future trade arrangements. And there's absolutely no way on earth we are going to hand shovel loads of money over to you just to stay in the customs union, the single market for another year. We need to say to them, we do the deal now and we get on and make it work with the existing implementation phase, because otherwise we will both pay the price. Here's the deal, get on and do it, and stop putting up ridiculous problems like the backstop to stop us doing it. You have to get rid of that backstop, because it is blocking what should be a rational and reasonable trade arrangement.
Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you very much.
I've been